Okay. So this chapter had a lot of information. Um, so let's go ahead and sort through all of it. Really within this chapter, what we found was that there's like a lot of discussions on the waves of research that was occurring, um, specifically in reference to looking at individual differences or differences between Black people and white people in regards to intelligence. There's a lot of talks about different biases that impacted these findings, different fundings. There was just a lot of information within this chapter. So the video is going to just provide a short summary on everything that has happened. Um, so let's get started with that. So to start out, the chapter started out with talking about um, data tampering, and this was a big thing. It's a big thing now, um, because it's unethical to tamper with research. Um, you're promoting fraudulent practices and fraudulent outcomes, and that can mislead people to believe something that is not true. Now, back in the earlier days and earlier history, data tampering was very common. And typically it was very common in like the study of like the human skull. So within the chapter, they talked about different researchers uh, tampering with measurements of the human skull, leading them to suggest that certain skulls, such as Black folks, was a lot smaller than that of white folks. And you had different scientists call each other out on it, um, which was which was a good thing. However, it was, even though that person was called out on it, it was very hard to pull that research back. So you had a lot of scientists become biased by different their own beliefs, their own thoughts. Your book talks about experimenter expectancy. Um, so really, that's just the expectation that um, that there's a certain thing that is going to occur. And with that thought, there's not too much control over what that experimenter is doing. So in essence, the experimenter is acting in a way to um, promote or enhance the possibility of a certain finding. This was very much common in survey research among psychologists, specifically in twin studies. So by like the mid 20th century, you had a lot of scientists, mainly psychologists, looking at or conducting twin studies, excuse me. And this type of study uh, was like the standard, right? If you think about the way that twins are, specifically identical twins, um, they are quote unquote nature's human clones. So in looking at identical twins, they have the same very well, I don't want to say completely the same, but very similar interest, similar similarities in really just genetics. Now you take one out of the environment and put them in another environment, and you raise the other in a completely different environment. You can measure what is stable and what is not stable. And really with identical twin studies, um, they have provided us with a lot of information. Now, historically, it hasn't always been ethical, but from those studies, there have been a lot of important findings in regards to personality, intelligence, likes, dislikes, temperament, all of these different things that are genetically influenced compared to other things such as values and political affiliations, faith, non-faith, so forth and so on. So twin studies provide us with a lot of, well, they have provided us with a lot of information. Now, in regards to the chapter, twin studies were used to investigate intellectual differences. And what they found was that there was a lot of different variables that would that were confounded and impacted the results. And there wasn't a lot of recognition for those variables. So your book talked about Sir Cyril Burt. He was considered the father of British educational psychology, and he got a very, 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 very big IQ database for identical twins, and it was used at that point in time to support the impact of heredity on intelligence. So with twin studies, they were used to strongly suggest that heredity is a very big factor when it comes to intelligence. Now, Burt suggested that at least 80% of intelligence is inherited, and that the environment doesn't have a huge role when it comes to intelligence. So overall, there was this emphasis on biological factors, genetics, an underemphasis of the environment, of a person's environment. And to be quite clear, what we know now is that your environment does play a role in your intelligence. It's not nature versus nurture, nature over nurture, or environment over nature. It's nature and nurture. So it's your genetics in addition to your environment. And we know both of those factors contribute to things such as intelligence. But at that point in time, there was an overemphasis on the genetic factor. So at that point in time, people were not looking at they weren't looking further into the validity of Burt's research findings until a little bit later. And it was found that he adjusted the IQ scores, the classes, sample sizes, and tampered with other data. So with this specific researchers' behaviors, what you found was that even in studies that were attempting to be as precise in their scientific method, were impacting those findings. And to be quite clear, within research, the validity of your findings is really, really important, because if it's not valid, then we cannot generalize it to the population, that those conclusions are inappropriate. In essence, it misleads folks, and it creates problems from these results, to be quite clear. So while there was a lot of examinations with human studies, researchers turned to non-human animals to look at intelligence, specifically white rats. So there was a lot of comparative studies with non-human animals. So the idea was that there was a belief that lower non-human talents could be compared with that of humans. And if you really look at that a little bit more, it's suggesting that humans and non-humans, as far as abilities, can be compared. We can identify differences, we can identify similarities, but there was more emphasis on those differences. Okay. So your book talked about Robert Tryon. I butchered their name, so that person, um, they designed like a very, very elaborate experiment. And what they did, they had mice run through mazes. And so what they found, according to the study, they found that rats who were bred a certain way, who were bred to be maze bright, so to speak, um, were they were more likely to be successful in running through the maze than rats who were deemed dull. And with this finding, it suggested that that there was some form of proof for the role of inheritance in individual differences, specifically related to learning and intelligence. Now, while this study was precisely done, there was an issue there. And the issue was that there was this overemphasis on genetics. We see this again. You can see it, I don't want to say you can, but there's the possibility that experimenter bias may have driven the results that the researcher wanted to find or expected to find. So even in the most tight, the most precise, accurate, well done studies, there is the introduction of bias. That is why we consider error within research. And we know that because in the next section, they talked about L.V. Searle, who reported completely different findings from that of Tryon. So Searle found that that the strains on the rats on like their learning ability was not only dependent upon heredity. So specifically, what this person found was that rats who were considered to be maze dull, not smart, that strain of rat, outperformed rats who were maze bright or who were from a bright strain. So the point is, with intelligence, and if you haven't gathered it all together, intelligence is not just based only on heredity. It's multifaceted. There's millions of different things that go into intelligence. And that's something important to remember. And that's where a lot of the scientists at this time were missing the mark. Nonetheless, at that point in time, there was still this consistent drive to establish differences in intelligence based upon heredity. Now, where psychology comes into that, psychology was used to establish those differences in intelligence between between groups of people. And when it comes to eugenics, what we have seen is that there has been an overemphasis on heredity, birth control, and sterilization within writings of Western philosophy. So Plato, for example, he suggested that in order to improve the human species, the best men must cohabitate with the best women in as many cases as possible. And then suggested that the worst in the fewest, and that the offspring of the one must be reared, and that of the other not, if the flock is to be as perfect as possible. So within Greek philosophy, we see it. We do see some traces of it, or the significance of heredity, for example, in the Bible. So within the New Testament, the book talks about references to heredity with Jesus's Sermon on the Mount. So on page 94, here's the verse: "Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. And this is from the book of Matthew, chapter 7, verses 17 to 18. So people have interpreted that, or interpreted these documents in scriptures to suggest that within Western philosophy, there has been an emphasis on heredity, and even further with birth control and sterilization. So taking it all together, it's promoting this concept of a bad seed and a good seed. And there's more about that a little bit later. But there's like this, the point is that there's this thought that something good can only bring something good, and something bad can only bring something bad. And we know that as to be false. And it didn't help with further theories that had come out at that point in time. So really we saw it come about in the 19th century. So remember, in the 19th century, that is when there's this overemphasis on there's these discussions about evolution, well, excuse me, not evolution, about innovative science. And Darwin was a big person at this time with his theory. He proposed his theory of evolution, of natural selection, and a lot of his concepts were used to fuel that overemphasis on heredity. And what that theory suggests, or what people interpreted Darwin's theory to mean, is that when it comes to survival, people who reproduce with other people with good genes survive, and those who don't have the good genes do not survive. And you had a lot of scientists attempting to build upon that. And there was a lot of association between Darwinian concepts and birth control and other race betterment philosophies. Galton took it a step forward. And remember, we said Galton was Darwin's cousin, and came up with eugenics, or coined the term eugenics, as the study of the agencies under social control that may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. So Galton suggested that that it's almost practical to produce a superior gifted race through marriages during different generations. So suggesting that certain people marry each other to continue this line of good people, gifted people, whatever you believe, and promoted that. And a lot of scientists, psychologists accepted this viewpoint. And used their research, used the scientific method to prove that. And what you saw during that time was a lot of institutions coming together and funding this research. Your book talks about the Carnegie Institution for Experimental Evolution, and put in place of that was Charles B. Davenport, and he was a very big figure in eugenics within the United States, to be quite clear. And he compared, humans to non-humans, and suggesting that selective marriages can allow for human progress. So you see that eugenic thought within Davenport. And to make note, the person who appointed Charles Davenport was Andrew Carnegie. And Andrew Carnegie was a very, very big deal at within his contemporary time. He was like very rich dude. And with his money, he funded, or he founded specifically the Carnegie Institution. And also, you know, this institution served as like a very large, or really the first formal eugenics organization. And within the finding of this institution, within 1904, you had a lot of scientists place like this extreme faith on like produces like. And the thing about that, this like produces like, it's very, very subjective, very, very vague. But regardless, but scientists took that and ran with it and used it as a theoretical framework. And what the Carnegie Institute attempted to do, attempted to expand hereditary, quote unquote, research from non-human animals, non-human plants, to include humans. So really to expand the areas or the units of analysis for research, for science. And like with a lot of that, you needed a lot of funding, and mainly the folks who were funding it were very rich people, such as Andrew Carnegie, for example. So if you are working within that line of research, you were able to obtain funding. And to be quite clear, you were able to eat. So there was a lot of incentives in researchers promoting or doing research to promote eugenics, to be quite clear. And how psychology got thrown into the loop were through these courses that were being done through the Carnegie Institute. And what these courses typically involved was training people how to study human heredity, and so forth and so on. And with these courses, and to be quite clear, these were psychology courses, they promoted eugenic belief. And these courses, they weren't just taught at the Carnegie Institution. They were offered in different university institutions. So your book talks about Harvard, Columbia, Brown, Cornell, Wisconsin, Northwestern. They were teaching eugenics within psychology courses. So you have these big institutions at that point in time promoting eugenic beliefs within the coursework. So when you look at it from a systems point of view, that system is in place, right? So within these institutions, students were going there and learning about the assumptions around, assumptions stemming from eugenics. So really, there were two different lines of applied research. So the first line was concerted about, well, both of these were about approaches. So one approach, specifically eugenics, was mainly concerned with controlling heredity, controlling genetics, whereas euthenics was more concerned about controlling the environment. So if you look at it very, very broadly, eugenics was concerned about was whether people are desirable or they're not. Euthenics was about controlling or was about increasing the quality of human beings. So with eugenics, it was a lot more popular, a lot more expansive. So you had a lot, and mainly because like there still was that emphasis on individual differences, right? You had a lot of scientists work within this line of research. Not so much for euthenics, because it was control about the environment, to be quite frank. However, both 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 approaches were both approaches suggested that with warfare in particular, the strongest and the healthiest young men were eliminated, and both groups were advocating for peace programs and armed forces composed of volunteers rather than conscripts. So to be quite frank, eugenics and euthenics programs there were some things that were done that were promoting welfare. Much of the work that was done was focused around research and looking at human beings. And to make note, they did advocate, for peace. And to be quite clear, during that time, you had if I'm correct, about World War, the World War One occurring around that time, and that was both lines of research were suggesting that warfare eliminated your strongest and your youngest people. And that was something that both lines of research were trying to promote, is the strongest and the healthiest people, to be quite frank. Now, most of the people that made up the eugenics line of research were typically white and middle class, and also upper class as well in some cases. A lot of them consisted of college and university teachers, researchers, and administrators. And with this movement into eugenics, there was this movement against the socially unfit and those who were the racially unfit. And overall, psychologists in particular contributed to both views. With specifically those intelligence tests. So remember in the last chapter, they talked about individual differences within the armies. There were IQ tests that were being done. Well, psychology was basically contributing that by doing that. Moving forward. So really with psychology was being used to promote this idea that there was a superior race, and really determining, well, specifically how it was done was there was to be a determination on mental capacity. Those who were considered to be quote unquote mentally defective. And the way to do that was through let me back up. So those who were deemed mentally unfit were eligible for sterilization. Now, psychologists at the same time were working with sociologists as well. The American Breeders Association made up this resolution, making a team of scholars and psychologists,  anthropologists, medical doctors, lawyers were or members of this committee, of this research committee. And with this committee, what they found, well, let me back up again. Sociologists were also used in this, as I just mentioned. Sociologists were concerned with the methods of reaching those who were deemed psychologically unfit. Are parents of those who are psychologically unfit who weren't in institutions. So really, if we're being blunt, tracking people down, are finding people who are eligible, who are not in institutions already. So the committee made a classification. So you had the feeble-minded, the pauper, the inebriate, the criminalistic, the epileptic, and the insane. And there was a lot of, based upon the report, based upon these different classifications that had come about, you had different methods, different suggestions for, quote unquote, purging the blood of the race, where defective strains were found. These are what were included. Segregation. So simply separating men and women within institutions. So this included mental hospitals, prisons, and other restrictive settings to prevent inmates from interacting with these folks, or what your book suggests, reproducing. So simply separating people. The second was birth control. Within the United States, around that time, there was, and here's the thing about birth control, it was tricky at that point in time because you had people with vaginas, and I'm talking about women identified people, people with uteruses. Yet certain people with uteruses suggest that they wanted birth control because they wanted to stop having kids. And this was typically amongst white, middle class, upper class women who were advocating for that. Whereas with birth control for women of color, men of color, so forth and so on, birth control was more so promoted to them, also promoted amongst people who were working class, people who were below the poverty line, also to people who people with disabilities, people living with disabilities, excuse me. So what you saw was that you had free clinics and supplies being provided to these groups, so giving incentives. Rewards for parenthood. This is really for parents who were considered to be, quote unquote, superior. And it was used as like financial assistance. They looked like scholarships that would encourage the groups to have as many kids as they wanted. So it might have been like cash grants. So people who were considered to be superior, and this typically included people who were white and rich and cis, to be superior. So they were getting money for just based upon their identities. Restrictive marriage laws. So at that point in time, there were laws banning interracial marriages. So Black and white people could not marry, white and Asian people could not marry, white and Latinx people could not marry, and so forth and so on. So in essence, it was promoting marriage within your own race. And It's really important to recognize that, because there were a lot of miscegenation laws, um, and your book talks a lot about those. Um, Also, people who identified as LGB could not get married either. Um, so when you look at restrictive marriages, this placed a lot of constraint um, upon certain particular groups. It furthered disconnection, and in essence, it was just blatantly stupid. Um, um, so there was a lot of support behind this particular custom, suggesting that marriage would result in children who um, were considered lower, and really it was also created to decrease inadequate and unfit reproductions. Okay. Eutelogenesis. So basically with this one, this is more along the lines of artificial insemination. Really what it was doing, it was an advanced technique for non-human animal breeding. And eugenicists were suggesting that you can use certain sires for insemination for prospective human mothers. So artificially inseminating for a certain reproduction. That's it. And then lastly, and the most extreme, was sterilization. And while it was the most extreme, it was the most common. Well, excuse me, not most common, but the leading remedy for the purging, so to speak. And it was legally backed up. So with sterilization laws, there were a lot. U.S. state laws allowed for sterilization operations. It was done on inmates, people of color, those with psychological and physical impairments. And really, to be quite frank, some judges, when it was taken to court, some judges did rule that it wasn't impeding upon due process. It wasn't impeding upon human rights, and in essence, it was saying this message was that it was okay for the law. It was okay for institutions to do that to an individual who was deemed psychologically unfit. And to this day, with sterilization laws, they were very vague and confusing, and they were worded very odd, to be quite clear. You also saw some European countries implementing sterilization laws, and your book talks about several: Switzerland, Denmark, Germany, Sweden, and Norway. And by 1945, more than 2/3 of the US passed some form of sterilization law, and nearly 44,000 have been performed. So that's a lot of people who were sterilized at that point in time. And that was going on for quite a while. So with sterilization laws, there was this idea that behind it, suggesting that it was like a like father, like son mentality. So I mentioned earlier the bad seed philosophy. So now we're going to talk about exactly what that is. So your book talked about the Juke family. And with this family, there was discussion about theories of inheritance of mental and social deficits. despite the researchers' warnings around environmental considerations. Now, allegedly, this family was problematic. And with this family in particular, they scattered after the Industrial Revolution. Remember, the Industrial Revolution is where you had this rise in technology within like the North. So you had people saying, fuck it, I'm going to make a better life for myself. So you had people like scattered all over the place. And what came about that study, it really suggested that there was this sense that people who were in this family married other people and had kids with these people, and these kids were bad seeds, so to speak. Your book talked about Martin Kallikak, and Martin Kallikak was a Revolutionary War soldier. He had good and bad kids. So the bad kids, according to the book, were his children with a supposed feeble-minded individual, woman, and then he married a good Quaker girl. So they traced his kids. They found over 480 descendants, and they looked at the quality of life his kids were living and compared all the kids together. And it was found that the children that are, it was suggested that how can I say this nicely? It was suggested that the people that he had children with the quote unquote feeble-minded individual were quote unquote social undesirables. Now, it's important to remember that this was fictionalized, but there was this promotion of this history. And a lot of researchers, historians followed that line. And they were suggesting that people, they were suggesting that depending upon the person that you marry and the person that you have kids with, there's this promotion of them being the children being an undesirable or desirable person within society. So really, when you look at that all together, there was this idea that once again we see that there's an overemphasis on people who are considered bad seeds, overemphasis on heredity and inheritance. So throughout the lecture, I've talked about, you've heard me say overemphasis on heredity and so forth and so on 1 billion times. And to be quite frank, there's a reason for that. When you look at the way that research was done and how the book provided them within the chapter, you saw that there was rises in research that promoted that, and then there was a decline, a rise, decline, rise, decline, and really that was the trend. You had a lot of different researchers promoting this trend, and mainly at the time as well, there was a lot of different funding sources for that. The Pioneer Fund, for example, promoting this line of research. the concept, to be quite frank, the concept of genetically disadvantaged composition of people was continuously promoted, and there was this rise in it and then a decline and a rise and a decline. So it comes in waves of history. So when we look at history as a whole, we have observed that when there has been declines in uh, declines in uh, different expressions of oppression by the majority group, there's a very strong rise in it again. And then it goes down, and then it goes back up, and then down, and then up. So when you look at that history, that timeline that your book outlines, you notice that. So think about 1945. Sterilization laws were coming about when World War II was damn near over, right? So there was a rise in that form of research. Actually, so backing up, around the time that the World War II started, there was the Eugenics Society promoting that form of research. And then in Nazi Germany, or at that point in time in German history, you saw the extermination, the oppression, the marginalization, the violence against people who identified as Jewish, and not just people who identified as Jewish, but people living with disabilities. So that included physical and psychological, people who were older, people who were of a different faith or non-faith, people who identified as LGBT. So you saw a lot of different violences committed against those groups within Europe, and specifically within Germany, within Italy, so forth and so on. So, and that was spreading across Europe. And you also saw it within the United States. The United States has been guilty of doing that to the same people. If we look at the history of the indigenous peoples, you saw like there was an extermination and assimilation of some of the different assimilation into the culture, and then extermination at certain points in time in the history of indigenous peoples. You also saw the controlling of Black and brown bodies of those who were slaves. And importantly of all too, the United States was, during the time of World War II, they were placing Japanese Americans within internment camps. So overall, when we look at history as a whole, when there's this promotion of racist or some form of ist beliefs, you see a rise in the rise in the research from these scientists. But then when that is not promoted anymore, when measures have been taken to decrease that expression of oppression, there's that decrease in the research as well. And then it goes back up. So the point that I'm trying to make with this whole chapter is that with the research, it came in waves. The sense of Eurocentrism. Now, at that point in time, you didn't just have like people of color just sitting there taking it. In particular, same thing with other people of different marginalized groups. What you found was that this was there was this promotion of helplessness amongst people of color, women who were not scientists. However, what your book discusses is that the Black teachers, the Black scholars, were not silent on this. So that's pretty much it for the chapter. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me.